I'm Shannon Theobald, and this is Big Food, Big Future, where we teach you how to make a positive impact in the food system to leverage influence for good. Thanks for coming. I am so glad you're here to chat today. Real treat for y'all today that brings together pretty much everything we have and will talk about in this podcast. Today we're with Tony Hunter. Now, Tony is an Australian food futurist who focuses on innovation in the corporate space. So exactly what we're trying to figure out here. He knows exactly what it is to innovate for good on a huge scale in order to get the impact we desire. All right, I'm sat here with Tony. Tony, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Hi, Shannon. Great to be with you. Yeah, my name's Tony Hunter, and I'm a food futurist. And people say to me, what does a food futurist do? Well, what I say is I want to help companies to understand how all these wonderful new food technologies are going to affect the future of their company, but also to just people generally seeing all these changes and becoming comfortable with them. Because as you and I were saying just a few moments ago, the only thing constant in life is change. We're always going to have change, and we need to come to terms with it one way or another.
Definitely. Yeah. And I am so embracing that term food futurist right now in my journey too. So love to hear you say that. Have that community.
Great.
Awesome. So I love to ask all my guests this just to get a firm basis, because I think, what's so beautiful about food is that it's something we all relate to. Every single person on this earth is impacted by it. So can you tell us a little bit about, your relationship with food throughout your life, or maybe a vivid memory of food you have?
Yeah, look, I've been thinking about that one, the most vivid memory of food. And it actually, believe it or not, goes back to reading James Bond books. If you go
Ooh.
back through the James Bond books in particular, and it comes through in the movies, he's a bit of a gastronomic freak. He loves his food as James Bond. And one that stuck in my memory from one of the very early books when I was only in my very early teens, he said, the trouble is not how to get enough caviar, but how to get enough toast with it. And I just, for some reason, stuck in my brain. And I had never tasted caviar, not my background, just ordinary
Yeah.
food and stuff like that. And, typical Anglo-Saxon background of, fairly ordinary, not boring. Sorry, Mum, but food. And we were actually in South Africa at the time. Lived in South Africa for a few years, and we went over to Mozambique on the east coast of Africa there, and it was under Portuguese rule at the time, and the capital was then known as Lourenço Marques. And I can remember being a Portuguese colony. It had those huge, wide sidewalks with the tables there, cast iron tables. We're having the evening meal there. The family come round, mum, dad, my brother. We're sitting there and looking at the menu. And I go, I'll have the barbecued prawns. Now, none of us had ever had prawns before. And I can remember the maitre d' coming out, full tuxedo, bow tie, white shirt, the whole thing, brings out this plate of prawns. I'm looking at these whole prawns in their shells. And he must have realized that I wasn't quite sure what to do from here. So he showed me how to peel the prawns and eat the
Oh
prawns.
my goodness.
And that was that sort of real memory sticks in my mind. And my parents always said to me, we can always tell when we go out to dinner, when we look at the bill, which one Tony had. It's the most
Oh boy.
expensive one on the bill.
New experience.
Always, even then, looking for new food and new experiences. But that's the one that really sticks vividly in my mind from too many decades ago to even go into here. Um, of just there at that particular time, and those that one and the James Bond books, definitely the things that
Yeah.
stick in my mind.
I love it. Yeah, it's so visceral, it's something we can't remember when our relationship started. So,
Yeah,
huh.
you're right.
So,
Look, food is something
yeah.
that is non-discretionary. Certainly at the moment.
Mm,
Maybe in who knows 1,000 years' time we'll pop a pill, but at the moment, food is something
I hope
highly, yeah, highly
not.
personal that we don't have discretion. We have to eat multiple times a day, and it's something we ingest, which becomes so personal, becomes part of us.
Exactly. So, now I'm curious, when did you realize, when was the tipping point, so to speak, that your relationship with food turned into something you wanted to devote your whole life to?
I suppose in some ways it wasn't so much that I had a point in time where I said, aha, I'm devoting my life to food. I was one of the few people when I left high school that knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to
Oh.
become a microbiologist. And
Mm-hmm.
another one of those things that I can remember is, my mum asking me, "Okay, Tony, is there any money in that?" And I opened the cupboard door. I said, "You see all that food in there?" She said, "Yes, that every one of those companies employs microbiologists." And she said, "Okay." And that was that. I was on the road, and I ended up in the wine industry, which, of course, with fermentation and so on,
Mm,
was all
yeah.
about microbiology. And I think what fascinated me was these tiny living things, almost the origin of life. If you trace back the origin of life, fascinated me at the time. So I got into the wine industry, and then from there later on went into the meat industry. And that's how I suppose I started off with wine, and wine and food go together. Loved going out to restaurants, and then getting into the actual food side of things, well as a beverage. That's when I started. Yeah, look, I'm really enjoying this, and loved the innovation side of food as well.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Interesting. So you've got almost a interdisciplinary background, even though you didn't intend it.
Yep.
Very useful.
Yeah, that's right. So it sort of served me well that my degree was food technology and microbiology co-major, and I did a bit of a post-grad
Hmm.
work as well in the microbiology side of things. And I think that's why I love the futurist side of things. Is I've been involved in innovation for over 30 years now, and as we say, the only thing constant is change. So innovation,
Hmm.
new products, and that's what I really enjoy. I really enjoy new things and new technologies. And I want to help companies, food companies, to be excited about change and comfortable with change and not dread change or put their head in the sand and ignore change until it's too late for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I was actually at a talk earlier tonight with there's a company in the I don't think they're international yet. It's called Sweet Green
Ah, yes.
in the US. Yeah. So I was just at a talk and they were speaking about their experiences, and they said, they got told so many times that food is never going to be disrupted in the way that, say, tech has been disrupted. And I just so fundamentally disagree with that. And, they did too. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that statement?
I so totally agree, Shannon. I mean, someone who says that food's not going to be disrupted or isn't currently being disrupted has their head in the sand. And
Hmm.
you know what the problem is when you've got your head in the sand? Your bum sticks up in the air and someone walks by and kicks it, and you don't even see them
Oh
coming.
boy.
And that's what's going to happen to all these people. Look at what's coming into food. And this is why I think it's the most exciting time to be in the food industry I've seen in 30 years. We have genetics coming
Wow.
into the food industry. We have biotechnology, synthetic biology coming into the food industry. We've got things, examples of that like cell-based meats. Look at the technology behind plant-based foods that are coming in now, nutri-epigenetics, understanding the human genome. There is so much science and technology coming into the food industry that I have never seen before. And this is coming from outside the industry. And that's what happens. Usually disruption comes from outside the industry. Kodak were not disrupted by Fujifilm. They were disrupted by the electronics industry. And that's what we're seeing now, is that multidisciplinary approach coming over into food and making such a massive difference to what's going on. And anyone who thinks that food's not going to be disrupted or isn't being disrupted, I feel very sorry for them. They're not going to have much of a future.
A few things stick out to me from this first chat with Tony. First of all, I love the James Bond reference. Second, the visceralism of all of our relationships with food. This is something that's required of us, and one way or another, we're all involved. Secondly, the interdisciplinary nature of food is universal. Tony's experience with microbiology and my own experience with data and social science are pretty far apart, and yet here we are working on the same problem. Multidisciplinary work is becoming more and more common globally because we're realizing that Earth is just one big system. You can't show me one thing that's not affected by everything else. And food is no exception. But of course, this isn't the first time in history that we've had such multinational expansion. To understand it, we need to look back at the past, at what's happened before, and what we can learn from that to make a better future. So I want to show you an unlikely example. The Dutch East India Company. Of course, a very flawed organization, but there are some lessons, good and cautionary, that we can take from this story. Here's a little clip from the experts over at Cold Fusion to tell you a bit more.
From here on, we have to step back in time hundreds of years to reach the real heavyweights. At number 3 and 2 respectively are the South Sea Company, worth $4.3 trillion, and the Mississippi Company, worth $6.5 trillion, both in 1720. Of course, these numbers are adjusted for inflation. The reason for these astronomical valuations is quite interesting. In 1720, a bubble formed around speculation of trade between North and South America. The two companies mentioned promised that they could capitalize on trade between the American continents, and their stock rose accordingly. The speculators on these companies would coin the term millionaire. In reality, mass trade between the Americas didn't really end up happening, and the bubble soon popped. Okay, so on to number 1. Valued at a ridiculous $7.9 trillion in 1637 is the Dutch East India Company. The story of the Dutch East India Company is absolutely fascinating. The story starts in the Netherlands in a time called the Golden Century, a period of Dutch history between 1600 and 1700, where Amsterdam was one of the richest cities in the world due to its strong international trade. Trade was essentially how all countries made their money. In 1600, the Dutch government was worried about England becoming dominant in trade. To combat this threat, they sponsored the creation of the Dutch East India Company in 1602 and allowed the firm to become a monopoly in Asian trade. The company quickly became one of the dominant players in the trade of spices between Europe and Indonesia. Spices might not seem like much today, but back then, spices were scarce and extremely valuable. They were used in medicine, to preserve cooked food, and to add flavor to meat. Spices actually improve the quality of life. Dutch East India Company is one of the most important companies in history, and one of the reasons for this is that it was the very first company to go public on the world's first stock exchange. From here, it continued to grow until it had 70,000 employees at its peak. In the 1600s, that was more than 0.01% of the world's population working for this one company. The firm ran their own shipyards, built a network of hundreds of bases, and had anything from offices to warehouse and heavy work stations. In order to keep their ports and continue trade, Dutch East India Company developed their own army to protect the land that they gained. And this is where things start getting beyond any company that we can imagine today. As the company grew, their foreign colonies gained more land and possessed a sense of governmental powers. The Dutch East India Company had the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, mint its own coins, and even establish new colonies. The company was even used to fight against the Spanish Empire in the early 1600s. And remember, this was a publicly traded company doing all of this. It doesn't stop there though. There were also expansive sailing expeditions that resulted in the discovery of new land. As it turns out, the Dutch East India Company actually helped shape the geographical knowledge of the modern world. They would stay operational for 2 centuries and had effectively transformed itself from a corporate entity into a state and then an empire. Okay, so now we know that the company started by trading spice and ended up a tyrannical empire, but what was its most profitable business? The answer isn't what you would expect. The peak of their wealth came from flowers, tulips to be exact, and the story of how this happened has gone down in infamy. It tells us a deep archetype story. Although technologies in the world may advance, human nature remains the same. Tulips were first introduced to Europe from Turkey and reached Amsterdam in 1554. The plants were immediately perceived as exotic goods and their popularity began to rise. Having tulips in your garden became an important status symbol. In addition to this, the thing about tulips is they take 7 to 12 months to flower and only bloom for about a week. This rareness, and the fact that they were a status symbol and highly valued, made the tulip product a prime candidate for the first financial bubble in history, the tulip bubble. You see, at the time, the Dutch were pioneers of modern finance. They devised a way to set up a market where you could trade tulips all year round even if they weren't in bloom. The prices were set by traders that signed tulip contracts based on future prices. This was the very first futures derivative market, the same kind that we use to trade stocks with today. Over time, the tulip market became more complicated and flowers were priced according to their rarity. As with all derivative markets, things tend to go out of control sometimes. The prices of the tulips are pushed higher and higher by speculators who plan to turn around and sell them for a profit. This is the very same thing that happens in all modern financial bubbles, from people flipping houses expecting the next guy to pay for it, to stock and bond traders doing the same thing. As I said, human nature stays the same. Many merchants sold all of their belongings to purchase a few tulip bulbs for the purpose of selling them at a higher profit than they could ever imagine in their lifetimes. This was the 1630s, and the average person could expect to live fewer than 40 years and be lucky to make any money at all. Meanwhile, some of the tulip traders were earning the equivalents of $62,000 a month. It seemed like the tulips were a quick way to paradise, and everyone wanted in. During the build-up and height of tulip mania, the Dutch East India Company incorporated the tulip trade into their operations, and the stock price began to rocket upwards. By this stage, even England and France were trading tulips on the London Stock Exchange. The acceleration of price continued, and soon there was a price explosion of 20-fold just in a single month. To give you an idea, at the peak, a single tulip bulb was worth 10 times more than a craftsman's annual wage. By this point, the Dutch East India's value had risen to that infamous massive $7.9 trillion mark. To highlight how huge this was just one more time, if you put Apple, Microsoft, and Google together, Dutch East India Company was worth 3 times that combined value. So you might be wondering, what happened next? Like all bubbles, the tulip bubble popped in late 1636. So what caused the crash? It turns out that some of the buyers in North Holland refused to show up to routine tulip bulb auctions. It signaled to the market that people just weren't going to pay any higher for the plants. This event caused the tulip price to fall a little. Investors then got cold feet and decided to sell, so the price fell more. More people saw the price falling and decided to sell as well, and the cycle continued. Soon, the market violently imploded. Within just a few weeks, tulip bulbs were only worth 1/100th of their former price. This resulted in a full-blown panic throughout Holland and an economic crash that lasted years. The Dutch government would later make changes to the financial system to make sure that this never happened again. So what about the Dutch East India Company? What happened to them? Well, the company stayed very powerful until the mid-1700s, but after bad management and a war between the English and the Dutch, the company was dissolved and overtaken by the government in 1799, and the colonies of the company became Dutch colonies. So what does this tell us? The tulip bubble speaks of human nature and greed. Like many things in life, it's important to look at the underlying value of something and not just what everyone else thinks it's worth. The Dutch East India Company's size is completely unparalleled today. They were a complete government within themselves. On one hand, I guess it warns about the close ties between industry and government, but on the other hand, they did discover new lands, shaping modern geography, and also were the pioneering company to trade on the stock market, forever shaping finance.
I'll bet you didn't think of tulips when you thought of big business, but this company had such an impact in shaping entirely so many aspects of our world today. First, the government and business. This was very critical in the Dutch East India Company's actions and in its long-term effects. And we need to think about what that will look like for food, because future food products, such as cultured meat, are often highly regulated, and we'll really have to dig deep into what the ideal regulation and international situation is when we're manufacturing this at a large scale. Second, shaping the world. Like we've been talking about, our actions don't exist in isolation. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? We know this. So how will our actions in the food space, in creating alternative protein, in creating sustainable business practices at a large scale, in working with top giant corporations, how will these have an impact on both the day-to-day lives of individuals and on the way in which the world progresses? And finally, realizing that no one is too big to fail. We need to proceed cautiously and collaboratively. Not think of those we work with as giants, as heavyweights in the space, but as part of a network that we all exist within. Tony has a lot of experience communicating these things to huge companies, and he's helped them maintain their influence to leverage it for good without the mistakes of the Dutch East India Company's fate. I asked him how the heck he did that. Now, you said that food can be like as simple as an apple or as complicated as, all of these tiny firings in our brain that are making sense of the food we're eating. So can you tell us about a challenge you had in working with one of the larger food companies, and which end of that spectrum was it on?
The most challenging thing in working with a large food company, particularly when you're looking at global companies with billions and billions of dollars of turnover, is one of the employees there said to me, it takes a lot to change the direction of this big old battleship. And that's really what it is. You cannot stop a battleship on a dime, right? You've got to know when you want to turn it, and you've got to start turning that thing well before you get there. Otherwise, you're just going to keep plowing on straight ahead. And I think that's one of the problems with large food companies is they are so big, they have so much inertia that they find it very difficult to change direction. And I think that's a lot of the reason that we're seeing so many VCs being formed by large food companies. You've got Tyson with a venture capital arm, you've got Danone with a venture capital arm, all these companies. And for me, and I've had some robust discussions with people on this, to me it says large food companies are basically innovation bankrupt. The only way that they can keep up is by buying smaller companies and getting access to the technologies that way. So, I think that's one of the big problems you've got in these large companies is it takes a lot to change direction, and you buy up small companies. What I want to see those in 5 years' time, how many of those small companies have still survived, or their products have survived or continue to innovate when they've been swallowed up by a massive food company, like Nestle or Danone or Tyson or whoever. How many are going to survive? Because most mergers and acquisitions don't show the improvements projected. I think it's like a PwC study was 51% of companies underperform their competitors for the next 2 years after a merger and acquisition, even if they think they've added value. So my theory is we need to go back to the old days of the 60s of a conglomerate style approach, where that was the one where you have, and you still have today, people like Samsung who have got multiple totally unrelated businesses within them. Now, obviously, these companies that the food giants are buying up are related. They're in food. But if you treated it more in a conglomerate or a matrix approach where you don't strip away functions out of those smaller companies, which is what obviously a lot of companies do. They buy a company up and go, we've got 50 accountants, okay, combined, but now we only need 40, so we'll take accounting away. And then they do it for IT, and then they do it for other things, and you end up with that company, they're all just exactly the same. There's little differentiation, policies, procedures, standardization, etc. Instead of letting those companies run themselves and run small, lean and mean, which is why they've been bought up, rather than getting swallowed up and culturally just disappear into the larger organization. I think that's a real challenge for the big food companies. And it's going to be interesting, I say, over the next 5 to 10 years, how much of that innovative culture and spirit survives being bought by a major big food company.
Yeah. And I love that you say that because, you know, for so many people, it seems that like exit is the end game, which is natural and makes sense. But that's a huge part of what I want to investigate in this podcast, right? Is how can we keep the innovative, agile nature of smaller companies while also utilizing the massive influence that larger companies have. So I'm curious, in this conglomerate model that you're thinking of, now are you envisioning that existing large companies rather than directly acquiring smaller companies would kind of allow them to continue operating entirely separately? Or can you tell us more about what kind of structure you're envisioning?
Well, that's an interesting one, Shannon. I think one of the big advantages of major companies is they have the huge resources. So they have massive marketing arms, they've established distribution, they have a lot of expertise in financing. So they have got a lot of advantages. Where they're losing out at the moment is the agility to be able to develop new products to address consumer needs and consumer wants in the marketplace. And those consumer needs and wants are just changing ever more rapidly. And
For sure.
the small company lacks a lot of things that the big company can offer, and it's finding a suitable marriage of the two where the small company continue to be agile, continue to be innovative, continue to do what it does best while still getting the advantages of distribution network.
Tony says it's just like anything else in this world. You've got to take advantage of what you've got, even if it's not a lot. Props to anyone who caught that reference. See Kinky Boots. Anyway, in this case, what giant corporations have is big distribution and production capacity. And that is a really important thing because so many people currently doing work in the future food movement, doing sustainable food work, operate at a very small scale. And that's the nature of innovation. Look at the Bay Area where I'm based, you know, how many startups exist here? I could not even begin to predict. And they're all, for the most part, doing important, exciting work. But only a few of them will make it to a large enough scale where they can have a real impact on the globe, on the way we live our lives. Large corporations are already at that point. And if we can help them make the changes they need, we'll see the changes for future food, for sustainability, come about so much faster. So really participating with big companies is an integral part of supporting the future food movement. key is not getting caught up in pre-existing notions about these corporations, and also understanding how to work well within them. Of course, there's a system in place. There can be bureaucracy. It can be a lot harder to get things done at a 5,000 person company, 20,000 person company than it is at a 5-person company. That's just the way things are. And I've even experienced that firsthand myself. But that's a hurdle for us to overcome, just as getting funding is a hurdle in a startup. So if you take anything away from today, remember that food is interdisciplinary and universal by nature. And that's a really good thing, because all of the different skill sets, both from small companies and from large companies, are necessary in order to keep moving forward. They will inherently be part of this story. It's important to learn from the past, to learn from mistakes of companies like the Dutch East India Company, so that we can make sure to take into consideration all of the socio-political impacts that our actions have. And now these actions are going to be most prominent when at a large scale, with large corporations such as those Tony has worked with. That's why it's vital to find a way of working within those organizations, of focusing on innovation, on progress, so that we can harness the scale, the production capacity they already have in order to get the ball rolling for the large-scale changes we know are coming.